All right. We should be set.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, I'm going now. Okay. All right, Dr. G. By the way, I hope you forgive me on the air saying Dr. G, but Dr. Geelhoed, I don't know why, but we've always said Dr. G is much easier and much nicer and quicker.
The spelling is more simple,
Well, it's probably a bit of Anglo-Saxon bias here against the Dutch, going back to the wars between them.
I thought you were Dutch from the fury of the Norsemen. Oh, Lord, deliver us.
Anyhow, you know, I wanted to question you a little bit about your coming trip to Africa.
Yes.
But I first want to let people get a bit of an idea of what you've been up to in terms of the building and structure of the equipment that you're using that's made everything just night and day for your mission to heal, which is basically you financed that yourself.
A very big company actually stands behind me, and that was my American Express. Not the company, just the card. To date, that was possible, and that's when we were doing this, as I say, retail. We now have to go wholesale, so that many others should be involved besides myself, and that would also assure its succession and its sustainability. Yes, this year was a big revolution, because after half a century, to be a little more precise, 52 years of going in and out of Africa on missions, this time we came along with a convoy of essentially the first world being introduced into the most remote regions of the developing world. And 2 miracle machines accompanied us. Actually, I think viewers can see and the listeners can hear that these are 6-wheel drive, large diesel engine man-cats. They are unstoppable.
Can you bring it a bit closer so we can
They are defined by their term cat, which is a NATO derivative, and they once held the most destructive force in Europe, which was the theater nuclear force. With the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, called START, signed by Gorbachev and Khrushchev in Reykjavik, they had agreed to disassemble those pieces of the threat to each of the empires at the time, the 2 of the bipolar war of the Cold War. The Soviet Empire had 880 tanks arrayed against Eastern Europe, and those divisions would never be matched by America or NATO or any others to put a 1,000,000-man army behind them. And as a consequence, they neutralized that with platforms that were non-stop. They would not be interfered with by any means, on which were mounted the Pershing missiles and MIRVed warheads, and as a consequence that threatened the Soviets. Gorbachev was very nervous about that, but further didn't want to maintain an army that size, nor did he have too much fun as for World War II technology in his armaments, the armored divisions. So what he was eager to do is get rid of that if that other threat were relieved. And in fact, the both of them, Gorbachev and Reagan, were more than willing to give up pieces of threat that made the whole world perhaps less stable than this mad, mutual assured destruction. As a consequence, that was a very positive step forward in human history when all of those missiles were brought to Johnston Island in Hawaii.
Wow.
And incinerated.
That's how it all started.
It all started then, and when they, under international observation, destroyed the MIRVed Pershing missiles, and Gorbachev melted down the armor, and subsequently sent home a 1,000,000-man army, which maybe have made a major contribution to the collapse of the Soviet Empire, because 1.2 million men going home without jobs didn't do very well for the Soviet Empire, which came apart right after that. But there was one good outcome that I could see, and saw it rather quickly. We snapped up the man-cats, that which is a platform designed as a non-stop vehicle that would go where it was needed. So in fact, these man-cats, now having held the most destructive force in European history, now could be turned into probably one of the more positive things that we could devote to humanitarian care right at the exquisitely precise time in human history where most of the plagues and pestilences were brought under modest control, that largely through those Millennium Development Goals that had been set at the time of our turn in the millennium. And as a consequence, at that point when most water had been cleaned up and most of the nutritional programs and other things were coming under some control, it turned out that the largest causes of threat in both morbidity and mortality were those conditions that could be fixed by an operation. In other words, surgery became preeminent in public health. It was always the mark of modernity for a society that could put together surgical care. That was modern medicine. How would that possibly be even accessible to the most remote people? Well, enter the man-cat, and with that man-cat going off-road, and on it mounted a piece of the first world, a unit that was self-contained and precise in its instrumentation, looking all the world like my operating room downtown, except better. Air-conditioned, positive pressure, meaning no mosquitoes or dust or contamination came in. And these units, therefore, were deployable for the first time to the most remote regions. And as a consequence, I think this is an almost ideal sword-to-plowshare project whereby this piece of NATO destructive power has now become the humanitarian arm of Mission to Heal, which can go to the most remote places in Africa. So that was inaugurated in 2019 on the 51st anniversary of my voyages in and out of Central Africa in trying to reach the most remote people.
I have to ask you a question at this point. Why do you think, I've never heard this story before. Why do you think it's never come out?
Well, in fact, I have not been reticent about it, but one of the things we do wish to do is point out not the destructive power these once had, but their humanitarian power that makes them miracle machines. And the ideal part about this is that you don't need to know about the other purposes to know that it is very, very capable machinery that can go to places armed with what is now called triple point failure systems. All the engineering is based in very capable processes that, if they fail, are backed up by something superior in terms of wattage, for example. The 32-watt commercial, ordinary, consumer-grade air conditioner is backed up by a 64-watt military specs, no moving parts, belts, or fans. And it is backed up by a 128-watt spacecraft air conditioner controlled environment, which means triple point failure is that it should not go down under any circumstances that we can project. There are no mechanics, there are no debugging agents out there in the most remote places off the road that we travel. And as a consequence, these machines are pretty self-sufficient. They make their own power, they can filter and clean their own water, they can make sterile products from our autoclaves and also from the water cleansing. We can take it straight out of the river and come out as IV fluids. As a consequence, it is a very, very remarkable step forward. Before, when I would try to entice volunteers to come with me, they'd say, remember, I'm a specialist, and I need, and they'd list $1 million worth of equipment. You can operate under a tree. Not I. I am a subspecialist, and I need these special pieces of equipment. And now I say, come and tell me, what was your excuse? Because you're sleeping in air-conditioned comfort with a flush toilet and a very comfortable environment under air conditioning. So there is probably no human creature comforts that are missing. But moreover, electrocautery, laser, suction, endoscopy, sterilizers, and all the things that are present in a modern operating room are now present in our new mobile surgical units, MSU-1, MSU-2, and they come in modular units that are able to be shipped anywhere by air, rail, sea, or road, and most particularly roadlessness. So we can reach those peoples that had no access before. As a consequence, this has made a quantum leap forward for mission to heal, and also for the accessibility, coincident with the time in history when surgical needs are the preeminent ones in public health.
I got to stop you here, Dr. Geelhoed. You're not just any old doctor.
Oh, I'm a country doctor. I just happen to have quite a few countries.
Come on, give us a bit of your background, because you're getting into areas here that I've very seldom heard any medical man get into.
Well, I've just cited a bit of engineering, and you'd better not have an engineer listening who will already know that I've exhausted myself there in terms of triple point failure. I try to pick up a few things from each of the professions that usually are the stoppers that I get to before. I didn't know a lot about hydrology or about sewage treatment or about any of the things that are usually the kinds of problems that we take for granted in this part of the world because they're developed and the infrastructure is there. We have to create our own infrastructure as we go. And as a consequence, operating under a tree may have a certain romance about it. It may seem like it is the fundamental act of medical care, which is taking on the responsibility for the benefit of another, ahead of and even against your own. Those are things that I've been doing for a while, but that's a bit of a one-on-one. And when we realized that, we said what we need to do is not just simply clone that capacity and scatter around the world good-hearted people who are interested in taking care of someone one-on-one. We have to put a pyramid together in such a fact that there's a multiplier effect. There's a force multiplier, and as a consequence, we need these as teaching units. This is an educational machine. So Mission to Heal, which has always tried to indigenize care, meaning we will never start any place that care doesn't continue beyond us. We don't want to enter a vacuum, create a facility, and then have it disappear with our leaving. That would leave a vacuum that would lead to enormous frustration. It would be overwhelming the good that could be done and the few individuals that could be cared for. So we want to institutionalize the care locally, meaning that whoever the go-to people are who take care of the healthcare problems. Here we have a machine that will facilitate, that will enhance, that will make the care that you're giving so much more effective. And we want to leave you with that skill. So one of the most freely transplantable commodities on planet Earth is hope and education, largely going together. And as a consequence, we can bring that there such that they have the principles without the plumbing. We can leave them with some equipment and some devices, but the most critically necessary piece that is lacking is the skill. We are a skill transfer agency, and our goal is to take the motivated people and make them capable. We are not at all interested in making capable people who have no motivation, who want nothing but to get out from that environment. And so we are not an export agency for migration of skill out of these very scarce areas of precious resource lack. And therefore, we are Mission to Heal, an institution devoted to medical education and the indigenization of that care.
Wow. I got to take a rest here.
And there is no rest when you see the need. And in fact, one of the three things we do, and the three things we do in order are we take pretty good care of the people that we serve. I consider my patient clientele is the bottom billion. Of that 7.7 billion people out there, 1 billion have absolutely no access to any care. I've never seen a doctor and have no source of it. 2 of those billions have no more sophisticated modern care. And by that we can say simply surgical care, which defines maternity for the majority of them. So if they have an accident, if they have an emergency involving childbirth, if they have a congenital abnormality, or they acquire some illness such as a tumor or other degenerative diseases as they get along in age, they are doomed because they can't get to the care. They may not speak that language. They certainly don't have the funds and resources to get there. There is no family there to take care of them. Remember, every place I go has no diet kitchen and no nursing staff. The family has to be the one that takes care of them. And therefore, that is really inaccessible to them for a lot of reasons, principal among them being economic, and minor of those being political and religious and linguistic and all the other things that might impair their movement. So when you're looking at people like this, we want to serve them, and we do. That is our clientele. That's goal number one. We want to take good care of the bottom billion. The goal number two is we do this with participants, largely from the first world, and also always pairing them with someone there in the developing world. So we work side by side and we rotate so that everyone gets an experience to share. And remember, this is a two-way street. We're not there to teach them and learn nothing. In fact, this is an intensive learning experience for all of us from the developed world going there. We learn one thing that they already know, and that which they know we have to take as a graduate program from them. How to do more in larger numbers with far fewer resources. So efficiency, not just efficacy, is one of our goals. So this experience is life-changing for those people who go with us. They don't ever say to me on returning, yeah, I learned a lot. That's so obvious it doesn't need saying. What they do say is, to a person, I will never be the same. My whole life is different now because I've gone through this disorienting dilemma, and all of my presumptions and all of those premises I held before don't seem to apply in this environment. And I've seen people here who have not only survived, they have coped. Not only have they survived and coped, they have thrived. They are generous. They sing, they dance, and they are very wonderful hosts for us as visitors. They're not simply there as mendicants saying, pour out on us all the wealth that you happen to have and we don't. They're saying, come, let us show you how it is we live. And as a consequence, we learn a lot in that exchange. Number one is our idea that we give good care to the bottom billion. Number two is this thing I call transformational learning. It changes the lives of all the participants and not just those when we consider the beneficiaries. And number three is that primary goal that I mentioned earlier, indigenization of care. We need that skill to be left behind so that we do not operate and create a vacuum in the expectations of the people. They may not have known that you don't need to live all your life with a cleft lip. They have not known that someone with a club foot is going to stay non-plantigrade, meaning they can't use that foot and will limp around forever. They do not know that many of these things that we take as incidental things that you don't even have to worry about for the next month of the child's life, they're going to be incapacitated after an operation that's going to restore them back to normal function so they can go out and play football with the rest. This is something that becomes a miracle right in their own vision, and now they say, why can't we have that? And that's a legitimate question. Why? And why indeed? Well, if you consider this a luxury that you have to be able to afford, there is a good reason for not getting it. Well, if it's not a luxury, and if it has something to do with an accessible or perhaps a right, certainly these people should have the care that is due any human to maximize potential. The single biggest tragic loss we see all around us is the loss of that human potential. How is it that we can maximize and enhance each individual life so that they consider themselves worthy of surgical care, the highest part of the medical care that they see? Yes, it's common to get public health. It's common to have the water and sanitation. It's common to get some sort of nutritional support. That's spread out rather evenly around the globe, with the exception of some political and some geographic interruptions and periodic droughts and famines. The problem being that if someone is living in that environment and has access to that care given by the government or underwritten by some international agencies, a single individual has a problem falling from the mango tree, or having a ruptured uterus that had an obstructed labor, or having an automobile accident, or being run down by a beast of some kind, a horse or a cow or a wild animal. Any one of those is the end of their hope. And as a consequence of what we can do is at least be accessible and have that skill there even when we're not, that hope is restored. And they can live a much fuller life with the anticipation that all of their potentials are only limited by the amount of effort that they put in and not by something that was an act of fate that is imposed upon them.
Wow. Well, I must admit that I cheated a little.
Tell me.
I read your bio before we sat down.
I hope it was a short version.
So everybody, this very modest gentleman happens to be a professor of surgery at GWU, is the holder of the King James Scholarship, has how many degrees?
I forgot.
something like, isn't it 17 to 23, somewhere in that range?
That sounds like a thermometer. I'm a little short of that.
Anyway, come on now. You've got to start telling us a bit more about your background here to let us understand and start to comprehend just what you've said.
Well, what I have done before is work to the limit of my abilities, and the limits are rather apparent to me rather quickly, and then try to find out someone must know how to do this, and they've gotten around it before. And so if you bump into those limits, you say, well, I never learned anything about that. I better go get started. Instead of smattering at it as a dilettante, get yourself enrolled and find it out for serious, and sure enough, you can overcome that one. Then you will bump into another one. As a consequence, I learned at some point along the way that there are probably more anthropologic barriers to healthcare uptake than there are medical ones. For example, there are people who, for example, might have an acute hemorrhagic problem and believe that they aren't supposed to have a blood transfusion, or that there are people who say you may vaccinate your child, or there are people who say antibiotics are from the devil and you can't give it to my child who's got pneumonia and it's going to be lethal. That means no matter how many inventions you have in modernity, no matter how many arrows in your quiver, there are people who will not accept the treatment. Now, to some degree, that is their right. There are some exceptions. A minor child who's perhaps not an ability to make that decision and is imposed by someone else's decision. But we don't want to dictate to someone what they must have, but we want to have them know what's available, especially for those curable conditions. Therefore, when you say, here's all these things that we can do, why are you taking advantage of them? There must be a way around that. So we mentioned one of those, and that would be access. Getting a vehicle that can bring it out there would overcome that inability to find facility. Number two, the economics. That's a real big one, and it's a stopper for lots of people. I can't afford health care. Well, that's an unusual thing in an environment where you have people with a lot of luxury goods that are probably more important to be distributed somewhat more broadly. And how to do that, largely in a voluntary way, is what we're attempting to do. So our care is free. Now remember, when we say that, it doesn't mean that there's no cost involved in it. That cost has to be shifted from the person who's bearing the illness, though. And as a consequence, what we're trying to do is take away one barrier after another. The biggest of those barriers probably is ignorance. And that's why the primary reason we as Mission to Heal exist as an institution is for education. Our real title would be our education and training for care. That's health care broadly, medical care somewhat more restricted, and specifically surgical care. But each of these are part of a development program, because as anyone knows, the little peak at the tip of the iceberg there has a large infrastructure supporting it. If they realize they can't get out because they'll identify something at the top that's missing, example, an operation, they probably won't be that good in uptake of medical care. And if they're not very confident in medical care, they won't do very much in the way of public health. If they don't do public health, they won't do very much in the way of nutrition. If they're not going to be doing any of that, why would you take on education? Why would you performing arts? Any of these other things that are also social goods as well. The rising tide of having a pinnacle healthcare program floats all those boats, because the majority of what we do is medical care, even on a surgical mission. The majority of what we do in medical care is essentially promotion in general development, so that we have educational programs that extend beyond those in healthcare. So for every one of those things that I bump into that unveil another chunk of my ignorance, I try to learn something about that. And if that's infectious, for the others who are in the same process, we can't go and say, let's set up a neurosurgical program in Somalia without creating the kind of interest and continuing improvement in a lot of other areas of the civilization around it. And that's what we hope to instill.
Okay, I'm stopping there just for a minute because I want to cover, I was going to suggest that at the very end, or our last discussion should be, I want you to tell them a little bit about one of your expeditions.
Okay.
And I'd almost leave it to you which one you pick, but I would suggest not Somalia, but South Sudan or Ghana.
Sure.
Well, even the Philippines has a couple of interesting ones.
Sure enough.
But which would you like to pick? I've got pictures here we can show.
You call them, and we'll go through. May pick one or two examples from each, or one or more.
Yeah.
You call it.
I mean, let's do South Sudan and maybe the plague that you ran into in the West.
Oh, that.
So we got that in here too.
Sure.
Oh, that's the Philippines. All that there. Yeah, there you go.
Sure.
You got that. And this part too.
Okay.
So I'll leave it to you. I'm going to get coffee first, though.
Okay.
Focus on dry.